Welcome to the second part of our Alternative Views interview with author Pete Brewton. Pete has just published a book called The Mafia, CIA, and George Bush. And in our last program, we told how Pete analyzed the connection between the CIA and the S&L fraud, and how he discovered that George Bush and his family, unsavory folks connected to the CIA and the Mafia, as well as associates of Texas big shots such as Senator Lloyd Bentsen and Houston power broker Walter Mischer, were all involved in the S&L fraud, which was one of the greatest U.S. financial catastrophes and crimes in our history. Today, however, we're going to talk about how Pete came to break the story, about his experiences as a Houston Post reporter in which he discovered the connections between the S&L and the CIA scandal, how he decided to write a book, his experiences with Simon & Schuster, and how he finally got his book published, and what the response of the book by the media has been.
You've been tracking this S&L thing for a long time. What is the magnitude of the scandal?
Well, we all hear about it. It's going to cost taxpayers about $500 billion. That includes a little over $200 billion of actual losses that the S&Ls have incurred that failed, that the taxpayers are going to have to pay back. But when you throw in interest and carrying costs, you get over $500 billion in direct costs. But the other costs are almost as bad. What these fraudulent S&Ls did was create an artificial real estate bubble where they inflated real estate values artificially very much, and then the bubble burst. And that sort of spread out, the fallout from that spread to the banks and insurance companies and any other financial institutions that were lending on real estate. And so one of the reasons the banks are in big trouble now is their real estate portfolio. And the larger such a portfolio a bank has, the more trouble it's in. So the effects spread out through the economy in the real estate value. So it's not just $500 billion, which is an incredible hit, but also the indirect real estate effects.
I guess also you could crank into this the amount of money that was skimmed and stolen by all these people was money which did not go into productive resources, so that we're losing out from that aspect also.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when you think about somebody has estimated that the actual cost when we start paying back to taxpayers is going to be $25 billion a year from now on, forever. You think about what $25 billion every year, what we could have used for that. And then when you think about the money was basically looted and stolen, and that Congress and the Justice Department are not trying to get it back. And that's one of the keys to all this, is tracing the money and also trying to recover it. There's been none of that. I mean, Congress doesn't want to do it because they're involved up to their eyeballs. When you start tracing this money, like you did with the Keating 5, you find it comes in, some of it comes back to their own campaign chests. And the Justice Department, which is controlled by the President, of course, has not tried to track the money. They're interested in just getting the front men and the cutouts and the middlemen to cop guilty pleas and go to jail maybe for a year or two, and then go on to the next one. So they rack up all these convictions, but they don't try to really figure out what happened and where the money went and who benefited.
Pete, one of the reasons why the government has not done any real prosecution or investigation of this scandal is because they've been involved in it, going all the way to the top up to George Bush. We didn't really get into last time the complicity of George Bush's son Neil in a S&L scandal, the Silverado case. Perhaps we can go into that as an illustration of how the S&L scandal worked and the complicity of top establishment officials in this crisis.
Sure. We all know that Neil was a director of Silverado Savings in Denver, Colorado, and that when he was on the board of directors, he was being supported financially by a couple of Denver businessmen named Ken Good and Bill Walters. At the same time, Walters and Good were borrowing huge amounts of money from Silverado. And in fact, Neil got his hand slapped in administrative action for approving loans to his business associate, Bill Walters. What we don't know, what hasn't come out really before, are the connections between not only Good and Walters, but to other Silverado borrowers, to Mafia people, and to the CIA. And we find that if you look at, say, Bill Walters was the largest borrower at Silverado Savings. He signed on about $130 million of loans. In addition, he sold property to Silverado of about $90 million. Walters was a Denver architect. Walters and his partners, including a guy named Richard Rossmiller, were involved in the Texas Rent-A-Bank scandal back in the mid-'70s with Herman K. Beebe. I mean, Beebe was and Ben Barnes were involved in deals with these people. And Beebe specifically had transferred about $1 million to Richard Rossmiller, Bill Walters' partner. And they had all owned a bank in Marshall, Texas that was involved in the Texas Rent-A-Bank scandal. And we find that Walters was also apparently and had been accused of transferring some of his ill-gotten gains to a trust on the Isle of Jersey that was being funneled, drug money was being laundered through it by people in Miami, and S&L money from people like Robert Corson, the CIA agent, was also going through this trust fund. Ken Good, who borrowed over $40 million from Silverado and was Neil Bush's sugar daddy for several years, had also borrowed money from Western Savings in Dallas. It was part of the Herman K. Beebe circle. The biggest company that actually dealt with Silverado was MDC Holdings, whose chief executive is Larry Mizell. Mizell was a big Republican donor. He held fundraisers that George Bush went to. And Mizell had established trust funds done by a Chicago law firm whose partner was Burton Cantor. Burton Cantor was one of the founding fathers of Castle Bank and Trust, the bank in the Bahamas that the Mafia and the CIA were using. He was involved with CIA projects, Mafia projects in California and other Mafia figures. And here we have his trust, Larry Mizell's trust fund being set up by Burton Cantor's law firm. And Burton Cantor was also a close associate of Lawrence Freeman, the Miami lawyer who had worked for Paul Hellawell, the CIA founding father, and worked for the Mafia and had been involved in the big Florida land deal that Robert Corson's S&L was funding. So we find this circle, you start pulling on this thread, you look at the people involved in Silverado and you're back with the Mafia and the CIA.
Now, how did Neil Bush get involved in all of this? What was his initial connection with Silverado?
Well,
and what did he get out of it?
Neil Bush had gone to Denver after getting out of college and was a landman for Amoco, I believe, which meant he went and tried to secure leases so they could drill on the land. And then Bill Walters and Ken Good set him up in his own company. Okay, they were both big Republican donors. Ken Good went to the inauguration party with Neil Bush in Houston in 1988 when Bush won. Bush visited Bill Walters' home in the 1984 campaign. Bill Walters tore up all his brown grass and laid new green grass on his lawn just for George Bush's visit. Okay, they were pumping money into Neil Bush's company that was drilling dry holes in Wyoming. Was not making any money. He was basically his salary was being paid by these people. And his company got a big line of credit at Bill Walters' bank. So they were supporting him. Ken Good put him on the board of directors of a Florida company he had and was paying him over $100,000 a year in director's fees. I mean, outrageous. $12,000 a month was going to Neil Bush for just serving on Ken Good's board. They were basically keeping him going. And he bought
protection money, it sounds like.
Well, it's almost, somebody made the analogy that Neil Bush was sort of like the driver of the getaway car. And, the cops weren't going to shoot at the president's son. And so far, all we've had is one indictment. The CEO, Michael Wise, is the only indictment so far on Silverado Savings.
Now, what about Neil Bush and Silverado? What role did he play? Well, he was
a
particular
director, and he approved loans to his buddy Bill Walters. He also approved loans to the second largest borrower at Silverado was a Houston con man named Etrine Starnes. Starnes borrowed $77.5 million from Silverado 6 months after he donated $30,000 to the Contras. and went and had a meeting with Ronald Reagan and Oliver North. And he also borrowed over $25 million from Continental Savings in Houston that was supported by Mafia money from Herman K. Beebe. And Starnes was also involved with John Riddle, the guy who was transshipping arms to the Middle East, and had gotten support from Allied Bank, Walter Mischer's bank. And he turns out to be the second largest borrower at Silverado Savings. So Neil Bush was basically just sitting on the board almost like a figurehead, but approving these loans and helping his buddies out.
And getting paid also for it as a director.
Right, that's correct. No, though not nearly as much as he got from being a director on Ken Good's company.
Let's talk about how you got this incredible story. Now, your book is, to me, a masterpiece in the sense that everything is so complex. There's so many interconnections and so many layers of activity, and yet you were able to lay it out so that it makes sense and you can follow it. My first question is, how did you get all this voluminous material and keep track of it?
Well, I've been working on it for over 5 years. I mean, anybody can probably collect that much information in 5 years. I've got 3 4-drawer file cabinets full of documents that support all this information. But I mean, you just take one step at a time. And when I first started on the SNL story in the spring of '87, and looking at one deal at Mainland Savings in Houston, when it failed in '86, was the largest failure in the country. And you start running into roadblocks and people not talking, you can't get documents, and nobody's being prosecuted, and the money isn't being tracked, and nobody's trying to get the money back. Then you start saying something big is going on here, and you start pushing. I mean, if we hadn't run into the roadblocks, we might have stopped with that first story. But when you start running it everywhere, people covering up, the government not doing anything, nobody seeming to care where these billions of dollars went or cared to try to get them back, that's when you start looking, you know you've got a big story. And so you just keep going. I mean, and everywhere I looked, I found something. It was like, I mean, being in the oil business, everywhere you dig a hole, you hit oil. I mean, every rock you turn over, something scurries out from under it. And it was a wonderful story in that sense.
Well, you even have, I mean, divorce decrees were significant. Things
Yes.
like this.
Yeah, well, the S&Ls do not, the documents at the S&Ls are not public. The loan documents, where the money went, the closing documents, the public can't get them. Reporters cannot get them. We cannot track the money. We don't have subpoena power. So the things you rely on are lawsuits and deed records, basically. And so the divorce decrees and divorce lawsuits are they have a lot of good information in them.
Pete, let's go into the history of how you actually came to write this book, starting with your first stories with the Houston Post.
In the spring of '86, I was working on stories involving charitable foundations and hospitals that were not doing enough services for the poor. And a business reporter at the Post named Greg C. got an anonymous call from a guy that we dealt with for over 2 years, and his nickname was DT, which was short for Deep Throat. And for a long time, we didn't even know who he was. Well, this guy calls up Greg and tells him that he should start investigating Mainland Savings and its deals with a man named Howard Pulver. So Greg starts doing this. And we eventually found out Pulver and his partners had over 300 companies, and they were doing deals with Mainland all over Houston. And Greg just found himself drowning in a sea of records. There were thousands and thousands of pages of records in the real property records of Harris County on these deals with Mainland. So I was asked just to come help him sort out the records. And we did that, and then we went and interviewed Raymond Hill, the chief executive officer of Mainland Savings. And Hill's attitude was the most arrogant that I've ever encountered in my career as a reporter. And basically, he accused us at one point of stumbling in the same direction as the FBI. And I knew I had a big story, just the way he was acting like we can't touch him. And sort of really thumbing his nose at us, that I knew that there was a big story there, and we immediately ran into the Mafia. there was when we were trying to track the deal with Howard Pulver, who lived in Kings Point, Long Island, outside New York, and his partners were all from New York City. They came down and took close to $100 million out of mainland savings, left them with promissory notes that were worth, probably less than $10 million. A huge ripoff, and contributed greatly to the failure of mainland savings. At the same time he was doing this, Mario Renda was brokering money into mainland. In fact, there was an indictment in Brooklyn by the Organized Crime Strike Force talking about the money Mario Renda was skimming off of his deposits and placing in various S&Ls, and one of them was mainland. So we knew we had something big. We went up to New York City, and we found Renda's partner in this was a guy named Martin Schwimmer, who was also laundering money for the Lucchese Mafia family. Okay, when we went to talk to Howard Pulver and to Martin Schwimmer, we found they lived across the street from each other in Kings Point, New York, which is a very wealthy suburban enclave on the North Shore of Long Island, very exclusive. And so here we had Schwimmer pumping maybe $100 million in deposits into mainland, and the guy who lives across the street from him taking about $100 million out the back door. And so we knew we had something very big then. And then when we started tracking Renda, and then we heard about Herman K. Beebe, the Louisiana Mafia associate who was involved in all the failed Texas S&Ls. We started tracking Beebe, and then we find Beebe and Renda together at so many different places. I mean, here's a New York Mafia associate and a Louisiana Mafia associate, both at the same places, at the same times, across the country. So, we knew that there was a big, big story here.
Were you shocked or surprised to see that the Mafia was active in looting these S&L banks in Texas, or had you studied organized crime before?
Just on a couple of occasions we'd run into it. I mean, the myth is there's no organized crime in Texas, and it's wrong. It's just flat wrong. There are a couple of small indigenous mafia families in Texas, but no big mafia family. But Texas is basically under the aegis of the Louisiana, the Carlos Marcello mafia family, and there's lots of mafia activity in Texas. I mean, of course, anytime you have, people like the Texas oil men that naturally like to gamble. I mean, the way the mafia gets their foot in the door and their fingers into a new community is through gambling. I mean, that's the way to do it. And of course, oil men naturally love, anybody who likes to gamble has got all that money. I mean, they're going to have to, if you bet big on anything illegally, you're dealing with the mafia, probably whether you know it or not, and if you don't pay up, you're going to find out in a hurry.
There's a price you pay.
Yeah, and we found that if you look at all the congressional crime committees and their studying of Carlos Marcello, you find in one case where he was talking to a Houston oil man named Josie in one case, and we find John Meekum Jr., the Houston oil man, dealing with the Marcellos. So, I mean, you find them in Texas and dealing with a lot of the big wheeler dealers and power brokers.
The story was was running in the Houston Post, but I've noticed in studying local power structures in the media that usually the local media don't take on or expose any of the activities of local power brokers. But you were writing about Misher.
Well, I was writing about him, but none of the stories on Misher were running. Okay.
Oh, they were censored. Eh?
Yeah. When we had done, we spent 2 years working on the Mafia, and then we found out about the CIA, and I spent another year working on the CIA, and that's where I ran into Misher's former son-in-law, Robert Corson, and then all the connections, when I started looking at Misher, the connections of Misher to the S&L players. And that took me about a year to do, and in the fall of 1989, we were ready to run with the CIA S&L stories, and Walter Misher, of course, was in the center of it, and his story, the story about him, was scheduled to lead it off. I mean, because he's the glue that holds all this together, and it's very difficult to understand the story without Walter Misher. Now, there may be somebody above Misher telling him what to do, And I was told by a couple of people in Houston that there is indeed, but I was never able to identify that person if indeed that person exists. But Misher is the key middleman, the key broker of all the deals. And without him, it's very difficult to understand these stories. The stories were scheduled to run in the winter of 1989. We sent them over to the Houston Post law firm, Fulbright and Jaworski, to read for libel. They sort of read all the stories for libel and try to give us advice. Usually they had the authority, although they shouldn't have, to kill stories that they thought might get us into libel trouble. Well, Fulbright and Jaworski went through the ceiling on Misher. They immediately reacted, no, we can't run this stuff, and gave a lot of bogus reasons for not doing so. So we began in February of 1990 to run the CIA stories, but nothing on Misher. We had Corson, we had a Kansas City guy named Farhad Azima, we had a little savings and loan in Llano called Peoples that was lending money to CIA people in Florida. We had Silverado Savings and San Jacinto. We ran all these stories, but nothing on Misher. And we ran out of stories eventually in the summer of 1990.
It must have been difficult to write your story with the main actor not being able to...
Very difficult. and most of the national media reacted negatively. I mean, they did not pick up the story. They said, you know, it was too hard to understand, and a lot of other reasons. I think, and also the Houston Post is to blame for one thing, for not running a big series. They would just have one story and wait several weeks and run another one and wait. And I think it's just because they were afraid of the story. You know, they were afraid, you know, they just kind of wanted to stick their little foot in the water and see if it got bit off and then run another one if it didn't. And so they were released sporadically, and there was no Misher in it. So a lot of the national media did not pick up on it. I don't know if we'd run them as a series and had Misher, whether they'd have had any more impact. It's difficult to tell.
Yeah.
The national media really handles the CIA with kid gloves, and we can talk about that later why if you'd like to. But anyway, we'd run out of stories, so I went back to the Misher stuff, and I tried to get that in again, and the editors signed off on it. They approved it. I thought I'd met all of Fulbright and Jaworski's objections, and they were scheduled to run in the last of December of 1990. And then at the very last moment, Fulbright and Jaworski refused to sign off on the stories. The editors, even though the city editor wanted to run them and really recommended running them over Fulbright and Jaworski's objections, the editor-in-chief decided not to do it, not to do the Misher stories. Now, during this period, I was at my folks' ranch. It was Christmas time. I was talking to the city editor, and the Fulbright and Jaworski associate that was handling the Misher stuff was a guy named Tom Godbold. And I was talking on the phone with the city editor, said, Godbold won't sign off on them. And I was furious. And I said, you know, his job's probably on the line. I bet he won't get made partner if he doesn't kill these stories. You know, I was just talking. I was mad. Well, 6 weeks later, I'd taken a leave of absence to work on the book, and I had lunch with the city editor. And he looked at me and he said, guess what? Godbold just got made partner.
And that's a Fulbright and
Jaworski. So that's when I started looking for conflicts of interest. Now, a year and a half earlier, when Godbold was objecting to all the Misher stuff, I directly asked him, does Fulbright and Jaworski have any conflicts of interest with these stories? And he said, not that I know of. Okay, when I found close to a dozen conflicts of interest, including the fact that Fulbright and Jaworski was representing Misher's company in a wrongful death lawsuit. At the same time, they were telling us we couldn't run these stories about Walter Misher. In addition, they were also doing other things for Misher, as well as doing legal things for Palmer National Bank, this bank in Washington, D.C. They had represented Howard Pulver's company in an insurance deal, and on. And they had laundered money for the CIA, basically, through the M.D. Anderson Foundation, and conflict after conflict I dug up on Fulbright and Jaworski. Now, I went to the Houston Post I told them about these conflicts, and the Houston Post did nothing. And so I knew that I could not go back to work for the Houston Post if I'm going to have to run everything through Fulbright and Jaworski, who was serving as the ultimate editors on all these stories.
So was it at this time you decided to go the book route, that you'd resign from the Houston Post and try to write this up as a book?
Well, actually, it happened earlier. During the middle of the stories I was writing for the Post in the summer of 1990, Simon & Schuster came to me, actually approached me with an idea of writing a book for them. Simon & Schuster is either the first or second largest publishing company in this country, and very prestigious. And they flew me up to New York City and rolled out the red carpet and made me a very big offer to write the book for them. $100,000 advance, which is probably bigger than any advance on a savings and loan book that's been written. And so we began negotiating a contract, and I was insistent in the beginning, at the very beginning, that the book be published before the 1992 presidential election. This is in, by the way, the summer of 1990. And because not only because of what I'd found on George Bush, but what I'd found on Lloyd Bentsen. And at that time, it certainly wasn't beyond the realm of possibility that the 92 election was going to be Bush versus Bentsen. And in fact, if you recall, when Clinton had all the trouble earlier this year, in January and February, with Jennifer Flowers and the draft, he said that if he dropped out, he was going to throw his support behind Lloyd Bentsen. And now we have Bentsen being the leading candidate for the Secretary of Treasury. Okay, so I was pushing very hard, and Fulbright and Jaworski actually modified their standard contract to shorten the time between acceptance and publication.
You mean Simon & Schuster?
Simon & Schuster, I'm sorry. To shorten the time between acceptance and publication. And I eventually signed a contract with them, and when I took a leave of absence from the Post to write the book, I submitted the book on deadline, and I got back an editing letter a couple of months after that told me that something wasn't exactly right here, because they wrote me a 4-page letter that was just full of vague nonsense. I mean, it was not helpful at all. And when I had submitted the manuscript on deadline, I again put in writing that the book had to be published before the 1992 election, in writing. So we began the editing process, and I tried to accommodate their suggestions, and I really couldn't. I made some alternative suggestions. They okayed it. I submitted a revised manuscript in February of this year, 92. And after they got the revised manuscript, but before they'd even read it, they really cut me off. They would not return my phone calls, my faxes, my letters, nothing.